So this is the second video in my series on evil, and I want to talk today about the ends justify the means. My name is Brian L. Jackson. I'm the author of two novels, Light Warriors and Chaos. And today I want to talk to you guys about another common type of villain in modern history, or in modern fiction. That would be a villain who believes the ends justify the means. Now, this is a particularly dangerous and seductive way of thinking, and you see this a lot in actual real-life historical figures that are viewed as villains. Some prime examples of this type of thinking would include Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Pol Pot, amongst others. And what the ends justify the means is basically talking about is this idea, and it's a very extreme form of moral relativism, but it's the idea that otherwise horrible acts, brutal acts, harmful acts, become acceptable in the pursuit of a higher, greater goal. It is dangerous because it's easy to rationalize all kinds of bad behavior by arguing, well, yes, but I did it with good intentions. And it is a common thing you see in fiction. I think some good examples of ends justify the means villains might include Darth Vader in some ways is motivated by this type of thinking. Vader became Vader initially because he was, as Anakin, he was terrified of losing his wife. And because of this, he was willing to do literally anything to avoid losing her. That's ends justify the means. It's classic ends justify the means. Later on, Vader is also motivated very much by a desire to create order. Now, in his formative years, he grew up in the Clone Wars during a time when there was great chaos and a lack of order. Everything was fighting everybody. There was a lot of subterfuge. So this makes sense. He fears this. He seeks to create order. And to him, order is a high good. And therefore, again, he believes that justifies brutal repression of anyone who resists. Some other examples of ends justify the means villains. Sauron out of The Lord of the Rings is a good example of this type of villain. Sauron is motivated, again, by a desire to create order. And if you read the Silmarillion, and if you want to understand Sauron's motivations, it's important to read the Silmarillion in addition to just The Lord of the Rings, because it gives a lot of backstory on both Sauron and then his master, Melkor. But Sauron's of the two of them, I think Sauron in many ways is the more interesting, because Sauron initially didn't start out being malevolent, evil. His motives were more or less to create order. And this came from a belief of being wiser and having higher knowledge and intelligence than the mortal races and also the elves. And it was his desire to control initially was about creating order and what he believed would create a better world for the races of Middle Earth. And it wasn't until later that desire to create order led down the road into evil. And it led there because he was very convinced that any amount of brutality, any amount of violence, unbridled seeking of power and manipulation was acceptable in pursuit of that goal, to create order. That is, again, ends justify the means thinking. These villains typically, again, like the moral nihilist, the ends justify the means villains do not see themselves as evil as such. Rather, these villains they may see the act as lamentable. And what I mean by lamentable is it's like they might be sad, they might be very deeply troubled by what they have to do. But they believe, despite that it is justified in the pursuit of a higher good. Slay the one to save the many. That kind of thinking. In fact, some of these might even have some of these types of villains might even have a savior complex, where they believe it is their sacrifice to suffer with the guilty conscience for the evil that they do, because they are pursuing a higher goal. And many times these villains do actually experience some measure of remorse for what they do, but will suppress that remorse as weakness in seeking out their higher goal, because they will rationalize it as righteous. Some other examples of this type of villain: Magneto is a good example. Magneto believes that humanity and mutant kind cannot live and coexist, and since he believes in the idea that mutants are superior, then survival of a superior race necessarily demands destruction of the inferior race, Homo sapiens. And Magneto's character is quite tragic in the sense that he comes to this realization, to this decision, based off of this idea, based off of what happens to him in his formative years. He's a survivor of the Holocaust and comes from Jewish heritage and has seen some of the worst in humanity that produced this type of thinking in his mind. And the character is not a moral nihilist, I don't believe. He recognizes the horror in what he's doing and is even troubled by it in many cases, but will rationalize it on the grounds that the higher good is that mutant kind survive. His race must survive. And if that means the destruction of humanity, well, so be it. Some other examples, too. I think we could go to the Harry Potter universe, and we could talk a little bit about, not Voldemort. I think probably Voldemort would fit the category, one of two categories. One might describe him as a moral nihilist, or one might describe him as being a bit more shallow than that, and being almost walking along the lines of evil for the sake of evil, which I'm going to talk about in a future video. To the extent that he could fit the ends justify the means type villain. This is someone who really doesn't see anything wrong with what he's doing, and would more or less justify it. He believes he is righteous, and that it is those who would mix Muggle blood and pure blood that are evil. So I don't think he's an ends justify the means villain, but there are some who hang around with him that could be seen that way. Some examples of that might include the Malfoys, who rationalize what they do. And yes, Lucius Malfoy and his son and his wife are haughty assholes, to put it mildly. But they're also rationalize doing terrible things, including doing terrible things to pureblood wizards, such as trying to curse members of the Weasley family who are also pureblood wizards, and trying to kill them as necessary to pursue a higher goal, that higher goal being blood supremacy. One might also argue that the character Cornelius Fudge is susceptible to this sort of thinking, and that he does some pretty terrible things to Harry Potter and others in the series in order to maintain his power and cover up his incompetence. The common thread being that these characters are capable of recognizing evil when they see it. They're a little bit different in that regard from a moral nihilist character, but these characters are going to rationalize doing terrible things they know to be wrongful on the grounds that they have a higher goal, and that higher goal is righteous. And that's kind of the ends justify the means type of villain. And these are villains that can be quite persuasive. A highly intelligent and well thought out ends justify the means position is seductive, and it is a position that can be sold to one who isn't sharp enough to catch what they're looking at. So these types of villains are usually very good at recruiting followers, especially those of lower intelligence or weaker mind, who like the seduction of believing that they're serving a cause, doing good, serving the greater good, even if they have to do terrible things to do it. If you enjoyed this discussion and you like what I have to say, then I would encourage you like and subscribe. And also, if you think I had something good to say, I would encourage you check out my novels. Light Warriors and Chaos are both on sale on Amazon. You can get an ebook. There's a hardback version of both books, and there's a paperback of Light Warriors. And I anticipate before the end of the year to have audiobooks, versions of both novels coming out. So hope to hear from you guys. Thanks.